I've been analyzing media for about 3 to 4 years and writing for 7, with my most well-known work being Blood's Pretty, which will get its 3rd episode after this video, and through all of this time, most of my work has been horrible. But one which isn't formally public was my boldest, strangest, and yet strongest finished work out of the 10s that I've created. And it's called Gnar Overview, a story I started in 11th grade that took around 10 months total to create. Now, as a 20-year-old who just reread it a few times, I expected it to be bad like the rest, but it made me think a lot instead. But what is this, plus overview? My overviews are usually concisely told facts about the creator or webtoon I'm talking about, but this time I'm talking about a comic that's not only one I made 3 years ago, but also one that you certainly haven't read. It's not formally public, as the only place you can read it is my archive Discord server, where I archive most of my comics no matter their quality level. So what am I even reviewing? Gnar Overview is a LGBT story about sexual confusion, cheating, and grooming, despite me never going through 2 out of 3 of those things. Now, I wouldn't write about this again, but 11th grade me chose to for a few reasons. When I was 17, I was pretty confused, so I wanted to make a story about my experience with some added crazy elements, like the grooming and cheating that happens later, since mechanics-wise, I wanted to practice and see if I could handle something so dark and serious. And though I made a few videos on my old channel talking about it, I never wanted to be known for this story due to its radioactivity. So I only held it in my server for people to critique it in order for me to get better at writing in the future. And even with this video out now, it'll never be hosted on a website or fully finished since it's technically a rough draft. I was scared that revisiting this would have me thinking the story would be edgy or offensive, but it doesn't come off like that. Well, yes, I've got issues with it. I actually did very good in the most important ways. I see it as a mixed bag that gets better quality wise as you eat out of it, I guess. Since again, none of you read it, I'll give you a summary of each chapter, some criticisms for each chapter in between the summaries, and then a big character analysis at the end for everyone notable. Before I get into it though, you might have noticed the bad presentation, which is its most obvious issue. Presentation matters a lot, but it's not a deal breaker. Starters, the last webtoon I spoke on, is great despite its presentational issues, and like Starters, I don't think the presentational aspects of Gnar Overview ruin it. But things like my horrible handwriting, literal photos instead of scanned pages until the last 2 pages, and super rough static sketched art with a lack of pen makes it awkward to read. In fact, the handwriting isn't just awkward, it's the biggest problem out of each of these presentational aspects because it can hurt your ability to understand what a character even said, which forces you to unnaturally pause during possibly serious scenes. This isn't an issue for me since I literally have the original right here, but digitally it sucks a bit to go through. Plus also some pages are missing or out of order on accident, so that's also pretty awkward. This is important since these issues plague the whole entirety of the story, including the rewrites. Writing quality wise, they're far better than the original parts that I was remaking, but have even worse presentation than the original story, kinda meaning that if you want a better story, you've gotta deal with these things but like 5 times worse. I mean, what the hell? I made them on line paper instead of just using the excess open free pages I had from the original sketchbooks. Why'd I do that? Chapter 1. Each chapter of Gnar Overview is broken up into 3 parts and sometimes 1 or 2 canon bonus chapters or 0.5 chapters that focus on Arthur, the main antagonist, or people around him. Here's what basically happens in chapter 1. Part 1. We start with Gnar, the main character, who's recording his thoughts about his confusion on his sexuality. Then he decides it'd be a good idea to test himself with a dating app. Next day, on an app, he meets a 25-year-old guy named Arthur. Gnar lies to him and says that he's 22 when he's actually 17, and when he gets excited, his 14-year-old sister asks about it. He says he asked a girl out and they said yes, and after this, we cut to Gnar and Arthur meeting up. Arthur makes Gnar uncomfortable, so he says, "Gnar, I came here for a date, not a hookup, Arthur." But they get past it, and eventually Gnar accidentally makes it known that he's 17. Arthur actually really likes this and tells him not to tell anyone about it. Then Gnar asks him to be his boyfriend impulsively, and Arthur accepts and suggests a kiss in his car. Arthur, "I really think we should cause we're boyfriends and it'd be hot." And they do it. Arthur drops Gnar off at home and his sister asks about how it went. He says it was good and that she's 25, which disturbs Arceus and makes her demand Gnar blocks her. So to calm her down, Gnar lies about complying with this request. Later, Arceus realizes some inconsistencies in what Gnar said, and we skip to when Gnar's in his room. He gets a call from Arthur, who's being strange again, and this gets Gnar to think a lot when he gets in his bath after hanging up on Arthur, because he finds him weird. But, Gnar, wait, relationships can change people, right? I mean, I think so. What if I change him? Post-bath, he checks his phone and sees that he got 59 messages. Arthur says sorry about making him feel weird before immediately gushing about him, which Gnar shuts down, and they decide that tomorrow they'll listen to Arthur's CD for an album called Late Fashion at his house. Despite everything, Gnar is optimistic about how this will go. Part 2. Gnar is excited for the day and he gets a call from his best friend Jace. She's 17 and she tells him she's dating his other best friend Magnum, who's 15. Gnar says he also has a girlfriend who's 20. Magnum thinks this is sick, but Jace is made uncomfortable. After she voices this discomfort, Gnar says 20 and 17 is weird, but 15 and 17 isn't, which Jace doesn't know how to respond to. They go to Flick-a-Lay, which is like bootleg Chick-fil-A, and Magnum asks about the girl he's dating. Gnar accidentally says he's a hot Asian guy and then immediately says he misspoke, and Magnum presses him about it because it sounds sus, but Jace comes in and interrupts it. Another guy named Raph comes by and they chill out until the subject of Gnar's girlfriend comes up and everyone wants to see a picture. He agrees and gets a weird picture of Arthur cross-dressing, though before he can use AI to make him into a girl or something, Jace snatches his phone as a joke after seeing his face of shock saying, "She sent her ass or something?" Then she's shocked by what she saw, and Gnar looks over at her and says, "She's pretty hot, huh?" Jace plays along, though after they eat she demands an explanation and Gnar gives her one, but when Jace asks why he's doing it, he doesn't know how to answer the question. After thinking about it in the bath, he gets ready to listen to the album at Arthur's place. Arthur makes moves on Gnar, which he's not cool with, but he adds a condition that if they're gonna listen to the album, they must kiss. Gnar doesn't want to, but he wants to listen to the album, so Arthur kisses him anyway. He doesn't think about it and acts normally afterwards, but it screws with Gnar and he gets a flood of emotions and thoughts before focusing on the thought of "I didn't like that," and he's unsure about how it'd play out if he told Arthur that. So he's a little scared, but he says how he feels anyway. And Arthur says, if you didn't, as in want the kiss, then you would have definitely said it, and you would have done something, but you didn't. We put our tongues deep into each other instead. It was hot and you were okay with it. Gnar thinks that maybe Arthur has a point, and that maybe he did want what he just did, so he just continues as if nothing bad just happened. When Gnar sits down with Arthur, he doesn't bring it up again, and Arthur asks if he wants to try drinking for fun. Gnar's worried about legality, but Arthur says that they could have sex right now and be fine, and that logically it's dumb that he can do that now but not drink, and he tells Gnar to go off of how he feels instead. Gnar agrees to try some, and Arthur speaks more about how the law sometimes is nonsense, which Gnar further hears out. Arthur, it's just sometimes the law is nonsense, you know, like with age of consent. This is so freaky. Like in Japan it was 13, which made more sense, but it should be 16, bro, what? Arthur drives him home soon after this and convinces Gnar to let him in, and when Arthur sees this, she gets a bad feeling. Shortly after Arthur walks into Gnar's house, Gnar gets mad at him because Gnar, "Okay Arthur, can we just have one non-sexual interaction?" And he kicks him out. Arthur comes in and questions Gnar about Arthur, and she tells him she thinks he's lying because he mixed up a few details about the girl he supposedly met, and that some of the details he gave coincide with Arthur. In the end, Gnar reflects on the day in a recording where he thinks about Arthur's point and actually agrees that their age gap isn't weird, and he thinks that the day sucked because Jason Arthur found out his secret before he goes to bed. Part 2.5. In this chapter we focus on Arthur and his roommate, Radke. He's raunchy and he dislikes Arthur a lot. So how about you realize that you're a creep, break up with that kid, and listen to me talk more about banging your hot mom. By the end, the argument actually gets serious with Radke saying, "Was that 8th grader right before he graduated worth it?" And that's where this interaction ends. Arthur goes back to his room and after obsessing about Gnar, he calls his mom to see if what Radke is saying is actually true, though it is. And his mom makes him extremely uncomfortable. Arthur's mom, "And why don't you come by and visit your mommy anymore?" Arthur thinking, this always happens. Arthur's mom, "Without your dad around, I get really lonely. I'd love a cute boy around to keep me company." It ends with Arthur agreeing to go to his mom's at 6 and her telling him to be more enthusiastic this time. Part 3. It's Monday and when Gnar goes to school, we're introduced to his acquaintance Hailey. She's raunchy and mean, though she has a crush on him and Gnar thinks she's cute, but he's not attracted to her. He gets her number and sits down with Jace, and she mentions Arthur, causing him to remember him and think that he wants him, though he puts Hailey's number into his phone. Once Gnar invites Arthur over, he makes a really weird decision. Gnar, he rung the doorbell? After pushback from Gnar's mom, Arthur comes in and it seems like Arthur's gonna get what he wanted, but he says this, "Arthur, I wanted to teach you, but in relation to kissing." Gnar, "Who taught you?" Arthur, "Well, my mom." Gnar, "Are you serious?" This ruins the mood and Gnar doesn't want to go through with anything sexual. Arthur tries to push him to move past what he said, but he won't bend, so Arthur questions if he even loves him. Gnar doesn't want to say he does since they've only been a thing for 3 days, and Arthur screams at him, which is when he relents and says that he does, and things get way worse. Arthur, isn't it obvious? I want you, and if you really loved me or cared, then you would have already been with me for me. This gets worse and worse with Arthur self-pitying himself and continuing to freak out, and Gnar doesn't forget any of this. He sits in his bed and says that he needs time away from Arthur after this event. He wonders why nobody came to help and why Arthur's already so obsessive in 3 days. It made no sense to him, so he shifts to thoughts about Hailey, which is where some confusion stems from. Gnar, shouldn't this be straightforward? You like guys, you're gay. You like girls, you're straight. Both? Bye. But no, what the fuck am I? Why isn't this clear? The next 2 days follow this trend of negative overthinking as he thinks about what Arthur did to him along with the kiss. At school for hours he thinks like this. Gnar, people do things for their partners all the time for them, but no, wait, I flat out didn't want that anymore. Shouldn't he have respected that? Or should I have just respected his want independent of mine? Are my wants to him less important, or is that not the point of what he means? He comes to the conclusion that he should have sex with him for him, independent of his own want, and this would fix everything. Thankfully, Hailey comes by and puts a hand on his shoulder, snapping him out of it, but it reminded him of what happened 2 days prior, and they decide to hang out that day after school. Part 3.5. This takes place on a Tuesday right after Arthur lost it with Gnar. He worries about if Gnar hates him after their argument, so he goes to Radke for comfort. He makes fun of him but agrees to do what they did in high school, and they chill out and watch a movie. Arthur compliments him, but Radke says not to, and they argue about him being a creep. And after, Arthur asks him to hold him like how he used to, which is when Radke reluctantly decides to do so. Framing plus dialogue. One of the best things about this old story of mine is the framing. Everything just happens neutrally. When Arthur says something disturbing and Gnar actually agrees with it, nothing tells us how to feel about Arthur or points towards a conclusion I want you to have. I just trust that the reader would know that this 25-year-old man who's taken advantage of a 17-year-old, even if the 17-year-old agrees to certain things, is in the wrong just for doing the things he's doing. This was an intentional move by 11th grade me, and it's a big part of why I didn't want to share the story, since I thought that many would misunderstand Arthur and think that he's written to be sympathetic or actually fixable, like how Gnar thinks, which would look bad on me due to what this story's about. This actually happened with someone who came in and read my story, since they read it thinking that Arthur would be redeemed or redeemable in some way when this isn't the case. It's not necessarily the story's fault since the neutral framing is powerful, but it is a big trade-off and what made it age better in my opinion. And about a year or two ago, I regarded the dialogue in this story as boring and bloated, but I don't think that's true anymore. While I've gotten far better at making more distinct voices for my characters compared to then, the dialogue here feels realistic to a fault. Gnar pauses a lot or stumbles over words. Arthur sounds like a 14-year-old who doesn't even know what words she's trying to use most of the time, and Arthur's speech is very measured and he rarely stutters. I say to a fault because I no longer think that this is a bad aspect, but I'm mixed on it. It better contrasts Arthur and Gnar, as Arthur's more measured and doesn't stutter, which I made as a subtle tell that Arthur's mentally a league above Gnar, and that Gnar's basically still a kid since he's horrible at explaining his feelings or finding the words he wants to use correctly. I do this for many scenes throughout the story, but the thing about it is that it's difficult to pick up on or actively realize when you're reading because their voices aren't notably different enough. And this leads to dialogue feeling bloated or slow, when that's intentionally the point to, again, differentiate Gnar and his friends with Arthur and Radke mentally. Pacing, weird dialogue decisions, and imperfect subtlety. The story is quick pacing inspired by Scott Pilgrim's, which was the main inspiration for this whole story. And though I'm now used to this kind of pacing, and I usually write like this is the first time I ever tried it in a serious story making sense. So there are a few weirdly paced moments like in part 2 near the end, where time immediately passes after Arthur left and Arceus comes in the room. This is a 1-page difference when it should have been a longer difference, and the conversation itself should have been longer. And the placement of it is weird because it feels tacked on to the end of chapter 2 when it would have worked better as an in-car conversation for chapter 3 like I end up doing later. I also seriously hate that I had Arthur come into the house with Gnar because it makes no sense. While I got the contradiction between him wanting Gnar to not tell anyone about him and him seemingly wanting to be known by those who are close to him, well later, I don't hear. All the scene does is establish for the 10th time that Arthur's a degenerate weirdo, which is unnecessary because of everything we saw literally in the parts prior. Big annoying choice I made was having a narrator. At the time, I just thought that narrators were cool, but it contradicts with the neutral framing, so I mostly stopped doing it later on, and it just remains as a weird artifact of part 1. As for the subtlety, this story is so hard to summarize because it lives and dies on its subtlety. Gnar overall does this extremely well, but stumbles in the first chapter. Good moments like when Gnar in part 2 questions if he did want what Arthur did to him because of the framing, and Arthur's yelling about how Gnar should do what he wants for him are solid and establish that Arthur uses a ton of different manipulation tactics that, because of the framing, you may not even realize are manipulation tactics. You'd only realize them if you actually know about how these tactics work, which on this reread I actually appreciate. But I think it was stupid that I made it so clear that Arthur's a freak. I develop him so well, and this makes a lot more sense later because of what happens, but I do think making him make Gnar uncomfortable every 8 seconds was unnecessary, though I didn't want to make it clear that he has a lot of red flags. Some elements like this are way too blunt, like some pieces of dialogue, but overall I did well at what I was trying to do, and honestly, it doesn't impede the story's quality in any major sense. It goes too far, plus flawed tonal control. Thankfully, the story handles the radioactive stuff well because I treat it extremely seriously, but it was obvious that I was very inexperienced with what I was doing. I always had restraint issues, and even now, I've always been extremely insensitive unintentionally. Though whether or not this insensitivity that bled into the story is actually an issue is something I'm mixed on. While I think that parts like chapter 2.5 where Radke says extremely wild things like "at least I don't fucking suck barely legal kid cock" go way too far, I think that the extremely emotionally heavy scenes where Arthur loses it and screams at Gnar is very good due to the build-up and aftermath. We watch and see how mentally disturbed, clingy, over-sexual, and obsessive Arthur is, and when he almost gets what he wants, it's suddenly ripped away from him in his eyes. And we see how that affected the victim right afterwards. It's one of the most impactful and important moments in the entire story, which also makes its intensity make sense. But its intensity feels extremely uncontrolled and purely emotional in a way that's unfounded in other similarly serious scenes later on, which feel more focused and stronger despite this one's significance. I was practically putting in all the emotion I felt Arthur would have on this page, while later I used more restraint, which made things feel more controlled and less suppressive. So I prefer how I did emotionally heavy things later on in the series more, though I think that this being probably the darkest moment in the entire comic is well earned due to its importance, impact, and chapter-long setup. Weird world building. In chapter 1 and very early in chapter 2, I wanted to make the species represent races in real life, with fish being, for example, black people. This is because I'm black and Gnar is heavily based off of me, but this makes literally zero sense, especially in certain places for 3 reasons. One's that the story's not about race, like at all. The only reason anyone would read this is because they're interested in grooming dynamics, the LGBTQ, and messed up relationships because nothing radically notable happened in this story, and that's simply not the focus. 2, when Gnar and his friends make racist jokes like in chapter 1 part 2, it literally makes zero sense because it didn't establish the fact that these furry characters have races that actually mean something. 3, if I seriously wanted to make the species differences matter or make some kind of real speciesism in this story, then there'd still be no reason to equate them to actual human races, and I'd be telling a completely different story. On top of that, the world building's literally non-existent. The max we learn that differentiates this world from ours is that people are just anthro-animals. If everyone was human, then nothing would change, and in fact, the fact that it's just the real world would be even more immediately obvious. The only actual reason I made everyone an anthro-animal is because I created Gnar on a whim as a self-insert in 11th grade since we were randomly talking about narwhals in class. That's where the whole idea for the story originates from. Misc plus Hyperspecifics. Subtlety-wise, part 2.5's pieces of dialogue hurt what I was attempting to do since I wanted to make a subtle tell that Radke and Arthur had some kind of past. The only thing I like that has anything to do with you as your ma isn't true, and it contradicts with what he says in chapter 3.5 where he's hanging out with Arthur and actually comforting him. In fact, this sort of thing never happens again in the story, even though I wanted to make it clear that the current relationship between Arthur and Radke is more complicated than they just hate each other. I used too many weird deep cut references to things I personally liked at the time, or things that'd be impossible to piece together because they're too subtle. As for references, the band Escaping in Reverse is a Falling in Reverse reference, since it's a mix between Escape the Fate and, of course, Falling in Reverse. And early on, I referenced this all the time in casual conversations. Going Home is a reference to Coming Home, which is one of their lesser known albums, and the lyrics from page 83 saying, "My mind is like a puzzle or a Rubik's Cube," is directly from the song Fuck the Rest, from Fashionably Late. And while it's one of the best songs off the album, it's literally 13 years old and it was never really well known. One thing I didn't mention is also that Radke His name is also a reference to Falling in Reverse because the main lead singer's name is Radke, like Ronnie Radke, and Arthur used to call him that, so Ronnie Radke, you know, clear reference if you know the band. Referencing a controversial band I liked is pretty harmless since it specifically has nothing to do with what actually happens, but I think I missed out on the potential to make Jace Magnum's age gap something more talked about, as opposed to a small background element. It could have been interesting if Jace and Gnar talked about Arthur, with Gnar being really defensive and bringing up the fact that Jace is dating a sophomore, but this kind of conflict between the two never happens, and they remain great friends with basically nothing rocky throughout the story. I think 2.5's best part is a short conversation Arthur had with his mom. I feel that it's actually creepy and perfectly gives you context as to why Arthur's this way, but I feel as if I made it too clear given what I do in later bonus chapters with chapter 2, making this initially solid presentation of Arthur's mom's character somewhat unnecessary since we literally later see how he grew up and what he went through as a teenager. Original intent, original planning from September 9th, 2023. Premise plus central conflict. Our main character is a 17-year-old sexually confused narwhal in a community that doesn't tolerate gays very well. 2 months away from being 18, during a night, he decides to try online dating and meets a 25-year-old bunny guy named Arthur, and they start going out pretty casually even though the age gap is super weird. Arthur wants Gnar to move in with him when he's 18 and done with school, so he has complete control over him, but Gnar doesn't realize Arthur's ulterior motives. Gnar's gonna either have to be broken up by an outside force or realize that this relationship is messed up and somehow break it off with Arthur before the plan. I can't find the original plans for the key events of Gnar Walshar after extensive searching, but this is one of the earliest records I have of me planning an aspect of the story, and man, it's only a little different from how it actually panned out. Chapter 1, when I created it, was meant to introduce us to Arthur and Gnar's dynamic while also showing who Arthur is based off of what he says, his actions, and how he acts throughout the chapter, and it even aims to answer why he's this way as well. I also wanted to establish that Gnar is a bit of a liar, and for these main goals I say that I actually passed very well, and I just do so better later on. Overall feelings. I think chapter 1 is the worst out of all of Gnar Walshar. Yes, it has great elements, but it's clear that I'm inexperienced and practicing with these concepts that, while I execute them pretty well, I'm also executing them for the first time. That's the worst part of chapter 1, is that you can read this and tell that even though it feels like I have an idea of what I want to do, I'm inexperienced and experience could help me majorly. Plus, maybe actually making rough drafts and planning the story before this instead of writing it as I went with key ideas of what must happen in each chapter might have made things a bit more focused and better. This is a bigger issue than not though, because first impressions on first chapters are the most important. If your first chapter sucks, then nobody's gonna read it. This chapter in no way sucks if I'm being totally honest with how I feel about it, but it is weak and handles the subject matter more heavy-handedly than its successors. Reflecting on this made me realize that it's best to draft out and plan out your ideas instead of winging it while just knowing what you want to do. The whole story has great energy and consistency, and I don't think there are any real dull moments because of how I wrote it, but it's so blunt and uncontrolled because I never had a phase of controlling the story. The rewrites captured this kind of thought of controlling the story well because Gnar Walshar was initially a rough draft, and the best scenes in the entire story were the only ones that were planned. The screaming scene with Arthur had a draft before I actually made it, for example. Chapter 2. This is where the story gets better since I've become more used to the ideas that I'm attempting to execute. So here's what happens. Part 1. We pick up with Gnar and Hailey hanging out. They talk and Hailey's super aggressive to Gnar with telling her she's interested, and when they go to flick a lay, she says Gnar's her boyfriend and he leans into it. Gnar, holy shit, what am I doing? They go back to his place and Hailey's still aggressive, so Gnar decides to kiss her and say I do want to date you, since she asked. She sleeps over at Gnar's, separate beds of course, but he's internally panicking about how screwed he is. Though Hailey interrupts and makes sure she's not weirding him out, and she asks if he felt forced to kiss her. Hailey, cause when you kiss me, like you acted unlike you, but Gnar tells her she's overthinking things and not to worry. The next day, it's 4 PM and he feels as if he sort of lied to her, and then he thinks about Arthur because he technically ghosted him now for 4 days. Arthur begs Gnar to meet up and for forgiveness, and when they do, he offers a genuine good apology. Arthur, I swear that I won't do it again. When you need boundaries, I'll respect them. Gnar instantly forgives him, and while he doesn't say love you since it's early, he makes moves on him since he's thinking about what he said he'd do for Arthur earlier. Once they get back, Radke interrupts and makes fun of Arthur, and Arthur when they're outside tells Gnar that because of that, he's not up for it anymore. Gnar's shocked and Arthur asks if he wants to be taken home, but instead Gnar wants to talk and he wants to bring up Monday, though internally he thinks that he'd yell at him if he did. Arthur interrupts his thought process and Gnar awkwardly tells him how he feels and that he's not really ready for what Arthur wants, and he comforts him and affirms that he won't break his boundaries while telling him not to worry about the age gap if that's the issue. Afterwards, they decide to hang out. Arthur's really flirty and they're both enjoying themselves, but Gnar asks about advice on how to deal with girls. Arthur gives him some, but when Gnar says, "I kinda let her on, I guess," it makes Arthur worry because to him it sounds like this recently happened. Gnar tries to lie and say that it was a month ago, but Arthur says it's okay if he cheated and that he'd forgive him anyway. Though, to comfort him when he put his hand on his face, reminded Gnar of what happened a few days ago and he says, "Don't touch me there, Arthur," reacting sharply. Despite everything, Gnar had a good time, even if he was a bit uncomfortable because of what Arthur did to him in the past. He thinks he should have gotten over it, but he hasn't, and since Arthur asked to meet his friends, Gnar agrees to it. Part 2. Gnar wakes up on Friday, drinks some coffee, and his dad comes in who jokes about hoping his son's not gay anymore, referencing the first page of the comic. Gnar lies and says that he's not, and his dad tells him that Arthur's banned from the house. "Your mom told me he was yelling, profane shit and stuff." Shortly after he goes to work, Gnar's driving himself and Arceus to school, which is when she asks if he broke it off with Arthur. Gnar, I mean, relationships like mine with big age gaps have worked for a long time. I can almost die in war legally and drive now, but I can't be with him. Arceus can't believe he's justifying an 8-year age gap, and even though it feels wrong, she thinks that his reasoning kind of makes sense, so she can't counter it. Instead, she asks him why he'd start all of this, and Gnar just can't answer. They get to school and Hailey comes by to ask if they can hang out. Then he says no and thinks, "I hate the idea of dating two people, but maybe it won't be so bad if Arthur knows but Hailey doesn't." But these thoughts are interrupted when he accidentally bumps into part of the wall. We skip to lunch and Gnar asks Jace about Arthur, and she basically says she hates him, and Jace asks the same to Gnar, and he says he's been pretty good to him recently. But she tells him why she thinks he's creepy. "Jace, when he was your age, you're like 9 or something. Doesn't that feel at least a bit weird?" Gnar agrees, but doesn't give it much thought. Once they get home, he wonders why Arthur wanted to meet his friends, since originally he said he didn't want anyone to know about their relationship. Gnar drives to Arthur's and Radke lets him in, and asks what's so likable about Arthur. Gnar can't answer, and Radke says they never know, which bothers Gnar for the rest of the story. Arthur comes down, but Gnar's not feeling it, so Arthur asks about what's bothering him, and he says that they'll talk about it later. They get to the park and Jace immediately recognizes Arthur, though Magnum thinks he's cool. Jace, after pulling Gnar aside, says, "Why would you invite this weird fuck?" Arthur tries to be nice, but she's hostile to him twice, and he decides to threaten her into acting friendly for Gnar's sake. She's scared by him, so she agrees, and they go to a restaurant called Quick's. Once they get there, Gnar feels like something's off after Jace and Arthur switch spots, since during that, Arthur was correcting Jace's behavior and saying have some enthusiasm. So when their food arrives and they go eat outside, Gnar questions him and asks if he said something to Jace. He says he didn't and asks if this is about something else, and Gnar says it is. Arthur says Radke's lying, but he says that this is insane to consider and asks if he's hiding anything, and Arthur says, "You know how much I love and trust you, don't you feel the same?" This shuts the conversation down completely, and when Gnar drives Arthur home, he feels sour about it. He tells her sorry for bringing her around Arthur without telling her and thinks about asking if he said anything, before simply not doing so. In the bath at home, he thinks about how annoying it is that Arthur always hides behind love. Gnar, "I always say I do, but does that mean we can't have a serious conversation about trust?" He gets out, lays in his bed, and decides that he wants to talk to Hailey instead. Fucking rhymes, bro, I'm like a rapper. Part 2.5. We go back in time 7 years to when Arthur's 18. He wakes his mom up, who's in the same bed as him, and she wants to play, but Arthur's tired and would rather not. She pushes him to wear something, and he calls her mom like any normal person would, but she corrects him by saying mommy, as in she wants him to call her mommy, and creeps him out by saying stuff like, "You're already cute, Arthur, if you were." So to stop this, he does what she says and puts his shirt on. She says he looks like his dad, which he's neutral to, and she makes him pancakes like how his dad wanted. Arthur's mom, "Well, I made you some pancakes like how..." Arthur, "I'm not dad, we don't even know where..." Arthur's mom, "Don't start that, don't." Arthur, okay, sorry." They sit down and eat, and she tells him about his dad since he asked about how long the two were together for. Arthur's mom, "Around 3 to 4 years, then he started college when you were born and left." Arthur, "College?" We cut to Radke driving Arthur to school, and we learn that Arthur's dating a 15-year-old and that they're best friends. Arthur says he's gonna find his boyfriend so they can chill out, but his boyfriend, who's actually 14, just got there and he wonders about where Arthur is, before Radke basically tells him that Arthur doesn't really like him. He asks why he even likes Arthur and he has no clue, and he leaves while crying since Radke was being so mean. By the end of the day, Arthur goes to Radke's house and they watch a Drake music video. Radke, Drake can't do any wrong though. Great song. In the story, this was 2016 and I wrote this in like 2024, 2023. I wrote this in 2023, so this aged quite weirdly. And it's fitting that they were watching Drake because Arthur accidentally falls on Radke's lap. Radke tells him to get off, but Arthur doesn't. Arthur, it's hard to say, and you're straight, but I think I love you, Radke, what? It ends right here. Part 3. There's a 2-week time skip and Gnar and Hailey decide to hang out. They're closer and Hailey's more reserved, but still aggressive, so when they go in his house, she tries to make a move on him. He deflects by requesting to play some games, so she awkwardly says, no, let's play with each other, which catches him off guard. She's annoyed because they haven't done anything yet in the month they've been a thing, and Gnar tries to joke it off, but she's serious, and Gnar tries to shrug it off again. Gnar, let's do it after we game though. Hailey, oh come on, you always say that. Earlier, Hailey heard from Gnar's dad that he had a gay friend, so she asks, your dad told me about a gay guy you knew. Why didn't you tell me about him? And Gnar says that he's not important. Gnar, what are you insinuating? Hailey, I don't know. Before Hailey leaves, she tells him she feels like he doesn't actually treat her like a girlfriend and that she wants more affection. And Gnar says, okay, though Hailey wanted a kiss on the way out, which she demands. He gives her a peck, but she grabs him and pulls him in for a kiss, reminding him of Arthur and causing him to freak out. Hailey, Gnar, what the fuck was that? And Gnar shuts the door on her, not explaining why he reacted so sharply. He lays in his bed and feels like things are getting worse. Not understanding why he hasn't gotten over it, he says, what I don't understand is that when I'm with him or talking to him, these thoughts are suppressed. I don't get it. He hurt me and invaded my boundaries, but I want him still, I think. And cheating on Hailey doesn't feel good, but I like Arthur more. I mean, that should sound okay. One hot guy and one romantically interesting person all to me, but no, it's wrong. I hate lying to Hailey, but I don't want to lose Arthur. I don't know what to do, really. Saturday comes and he goes out with Arthur wearing a jacket he bought for him for his future 18th birthday, which will be in a few days. Arthur tells him that when he's of age, that he should move in with him, and Gnar's not sure about that, but their conversation's interrupted when Hailey calls Gnar about last night. He tries to joke, but Hailey's dead serious and says that she'll be over at 3 to talk about it more per Gnar's request. She says love you to him, and Gnar says it back with ease. Arthur, wow, you two are saying love you now? Gnar, that was the first time. Arthur, well, just don't forget that she's not as dependable as me. Gnar, yeah. Arthur, no, seriously. You'll probably never see her again after high school. I'll always be right here. As they both hang out, Arthur tells him that the idea of them role-playing as brothers is hot to him, which creeps Gnar out. Once he gets back home, he's pissed off because Arthur's always a weirdo. Why do I bother with him? He's a fucking freak. I tolerate him. Hailey's an angel. She comes over and Gnar tells her that he doesn't like being touched on the face, and they go into the house's movie room. Gnar goes to make them some popcorn and she looks at the phone he left in the cup holder of one of the seats and gets to thinking. He never kisses me, never makes sexual advances, never flirts, and barely compliments me. And he tries to refuse all of my advances, and he apparently has some gay acquaintance he's never told me about, so she checks his phone out of paranoia. Better subtlety plus everything is important. Outside of some specific lines of dialogue, it's clear that by the middle of the story, I'm getting better at tackling the tone. And I think that some moments are way more powerful than a lot of things quality-wise in chapter 1. A big thing's when Hailey's asking if Gnar felt forced to kiss her, which is a parallel to the actual forced kiss he had to go through from Arthur. And the entire date with him and Arthur at the end of part 1 is great. I think that's because I really internalized the writing idea of make sure everything is important. Nothing that happens is mechanically pointless, as it has some purpose in deepening the characters, giving us new info, establishing certain facts, or furthering the plot. Chapter 1 does this well, like with the flick a lay scene, though it's a bit long, or repetitive ones like Arthur coming into Gnar's room and creeping him out. But thankfully, 2 never has this kind of issue, and in fact, it establishes that Arthur can be normal if he really forces himself to be, despite him obviously being the exact same weirdo that he always is. And we get a lot of really fun interactions between Gnar and Hailey, which characterizes her more, and other moments where we see his internal conflict on how he feels about cheating on her, and how he feels about Arthur. It's all important so that we feel conflicted about Gnar. He's being taken advantage of, so you'd want to feel bad for him, but he's also hurting someone, so it makes it hard to truly root for him. And thanks to the fun moments, we actually grow to care about this person who he's hurting. Care at the utilization. While it's not perfect, I use characters way better than I did last chapter. I'll analyze everyone at the end since by then you'd have the full context of everything that happens, but currently I want to highlight two main moments that are really good. Near the end of chapter 2, Arthur and Gnar hang out and it seems normal, with Arthur appreciating hanging out with Gnar and him restraining himself on a surface level. But when you look at it for a while, this interaction shows why these two can't ever work due to the age difference and of course other factors. Arthur actively infantilizes Gnar a lot, even though he claims to see him as an equal. He puts his hand on his head and calls him adorable and calls him his little man and constantly tries to talk like him to relate to him. And Gnar also does not see him as an equal because he asks him for advice since he's older and already went through high school. He sees him almost as an intelligent authority figure in this way due to his age, since before he's in his eyes giving good logical advice about things like the freaking age of consent. It's clear that they don't actually see each other as equals, and while Gnar doesn't notice this, Arthur definitely does, and a later line in chapter 3 where he actually refers to Hailey as a little girl, even though she's 2 years older than Gnar. And unlike with Hailey, Gnar is genuinely uncomfortable with Arthur. It took Hailey bringing Gnar in and kissing him for him to remember the kiss, where here all it took was Arthur putting his hand on his cheek. And notice that it's always Arthur getting closer, touching him, or pushing him to physically reciprocate like with holding hands. Finally, the part where Gnar attempts to lie to him and about Hailey, and Arthur deciding to preemptively forgive him before he actually knows what Gnar did, is highly manipulative and establishes himself as extremely dependable to Gnar, which works on him since Gnar's totally used to Arthur saying stuff like, "You'll probably never see her after high school, I'll always be right here," after the 2-week time skip. It comes off as desperation initially, but it's really not that straightforward. The second example I think is great is when Hailey tells Gnar that she wants more affection. It exemplifies the difference between her and Arthur, as Arthur is mysterious, hiding things under the guise of love, and constantly breaking boundaries, while Hailey does the exact opposite. She cares a ton about Gnar's boundaries, doesn't keep any secrets from him, and truly from the heart tells her how she feels, even if it sounds mean sometimes. It's why she acted carefully when Gnar reacted in that way to her kiss and called him later, because she really doesn't want to break his boundaries and she wants to make this work. But unfortunately, Gnar doesn't appreciate any of this. Hailey's so obviously the better choice, but instead he strings her along because he finds her cute, and we see that he's cold to how good she's trying to be during their interactions since he's flat-faced. He just says okay when she's prepared to leave, and he doesn't do what she wants. Hailey, wait, I just said be more affectionate and you said okay, kiss me or something, because he simply doesn't realize what he has, and for other reasons that I'll get into later. I could go on for a while about why I think Hailey, Gnar, and Arthur are surprisingly good characters, and I will at the end, but the fact of the matter is that to even appreciate any of this, you'd have to accept that this story lives and dies by subtlety, narrow audience plus rereads. Gnar Walshire, especially by this point on chapter 3, lives and dies by subtlety, and some things are so subtle that I think I needed to think for over an hour about specific instances or relook at them multiple times. Every single exceptional element of the story is subtle, so nothing's obviously good about it. If you don't have a keen eye or knowledge about manipulation tactics, then to you Arthur would just seem like some creepy guy due to the neutral framing, as opposed to a complicated monster that sometimes doesn't even know what he's doing. And the same is true for the characterization of Gnar and Hailey, or some dichotomies I enact within the story. But it can also be good, since if you realize the kind of moves Arthur's pulling actively on Gnar, then your experience and understanding of how screwed Gnar almost was can let you appreciate what exactly I was going for. But for most people, especially due to the art, it'll just look like a simple gay toxic relationship drawn in a sketchbook by some 11th grader, because everything that works requires a ton of dot connecting, which just isn't everyone's thing. Plus, remember, these good elements are additives, which means that they hinge off of you actually enjoying the story in the first place. If you don't, you wouldn't dig this deep or care because you just wouldn't like it and you'd have no reason to do so. And I think this is why I'd say that the audience for who can actually enjoy the story or fully get what I was trying to do is extremely narrow. I think I was actually too subtle, and the subject matter of a sexually confused teenager being groomed by an adult is so hyper-specific and niche that even if I did make it a public comic, I don't think it would have been that successful. Calling a comic hyper-niche sounds like an odd critique, so I want to bring up what inspired the comic the most when I created it so you can understand my point. Scott Pilgrim. With that, there's a ton to appreciate since it's not just about their relationship or fighting. It's about him trying to be the best he can for his girlfriend, self-acceptance, and personal growth. his comedic and grounded moments with his girlfriend, and a lot more. There, if you're not a fan of the fights or some comedic moments, you can still really enjoy it for the romance or vice versa, but with Gnar Wildshire this isn't the case. The only big characters are Gnar, Hailey, and Arthur, with a minuscule supporting cast. There's no world building, and it's laser focused on its main plot. There's not even a single side plot, and it's a very short, maybe 4 to 6 hour read. It feels like a story that have more meat to it, but really it's just very solid bare bones. Due to its length and subtlety, I think that what also shrinks the audience is the optimal way to understand it, which is with rereads. As I said, it took me a long time to realize what the hell I was even trying to do with a lot of what was going on in the story because it's so complicated, but subtle in a way that just isn't easy to grasp. And the neutral framing doesn't help either. Nothing in the story makes it clear that something is happening or going on whenever a character says something. You just have to notice it yourself. I feel as if it's genuinely necessary to reread the story and think about it a lot, like 3 times, because of everything I do. Since each time I reread it, I noticed something totally new and different. I personally rarely even rewatch shows, let alone reread comics, so I can imagine a person reading this and not understanding things that are too subtle to get for average people, and then them not understanding it, what I was even trying to do or going for, because it requires a ton of engagement. As I said earlier, that can be good, but for the majority of people and due to its niche nature, there's no way this comic could have ever amassed any noticeable following, because it's practically for nobody except myself. On read 1, you'll be like, okay, that's messed up, and on read 3, you'll say, wow, that was more complicated than I realized. Most will never get to reread 2 or even finish the story due to chapter 1. And I also want to add that as the author, even though I forgot a majority of the decisions I made and why I made them in the comic, right now, I feel like I was only able to catch a lot of these subtle things because I wrote it. Because I can still kind of think of the mindset I was in while I was writing this and what I was trying to do. You, as the reader, maybe going back to check on this after maybe this video or something, are not going to have my mindset or notice the same things I'm going to notice because I actually made this work. Even though, again, 17-year-old me was thinking completely differently, and I genuinely just don't have access to that or the memory of what most of my decisions actually were because I lost a lot of that over time. Misc plus Hyperspecifics. Unlike the chapter 1 analysis where I had a ton of general detailed reasons as to what the flaws were with it, I've got more specific in Misc 1 since my problems with chapter 2 are smaller and nitpicks. Logistically and convenience wise, the story is confusing in some areas or unclear, but these are the kind of issues you'd have to intentionally point out after like 10 rereads. The biggest one is that at the end of the chapter, Gnar leaves his phone behind in the movie room and Hailey checks it, and she's able to get into his phone. This is possible since Gnar could simply have told Hailey his password or his phone was already on, but it's somewhat convenient. In part 1, Arthur and Gnar go to the park and he goes without a scooter. Then Arthur drives into his house, but I never made it clear that the park's a walking distance away from Gnar's house and that Arthur's way further. So when I read this, I didn't understand for a moment as to why Gnar didn't also just drive to Arthur's. There are a few more, and ones I'm probably not noticing, but these are the most noticeable ones to me. I believe 2.5's characterization of Radke is underwhelming. It's cool to see that him and Arthur were cool and actually very close at some point, but I feel like I could have done more than him basically being the same guy. Despite Arthur dating a 14-year-old at 18, he's clearly a very different guy as he's way more shy and reserved. This isn't at all like the Arthur we know in the present times, since Arthur never has a shy moment, and in fact, he's basically the opposite. So that means that he's clearly developed or evolved since the time he was 18. Radke being the exact same guy is lame because of this, and I think I should have made him meaner to Arthur and overall far more reserved in present times for Gnar Wildshire's bonus chapters to show that he has matured. That would have made him in this past moment more interesting, but that's not what I did. I'm not going to give smaller characters like Magnum or Gnar's mama character analysis because they barely appear in the story, but I do think I underutilized Gnar's dad. I went back and looked at some old notes for what I wanted to do with the story, and this is what I said planning the story back when I was 17. Homophobia on a more grand scale isn't seen as a problem in reference to the place the story takes place. Therefore, slightly younger characters like Magnum, who's 15, will be casually homophobic, or other small characters too, because of where he grew up and the people around him. For most people, it won't be because they're specifically taught to be homophobes, or because it's sinful or for any other reason. It was a norm and it's completely fine to joke about and see people as lower for it to make fun of them or anything. Close, end of quotations. I'm not 17 anymore. This kind of thought was going to go with Gnar's dad, but he ended up only having 2 scenes, and the entire story became so focused on the toxic relationship that I never really got to make this kind of distinction between it being normal to make fun of gays versus hating them within the story, because it was never really given a chance to be important. I could have made this a more important aspect if Gnar's parents or other characters like Magnum were more involved in the story, but it ends up being the reverse. Magnum's a side character with only like 2-3 scenes total, and Gnar's dad only appears twice. I'm mixed on if this is truly bad or just alright, because the story ended up being solid by the end nonetheless, but it could have added more to the original characters of Magnum and Gnar's dad for extra strife in Gnar's life in his attempt to be with Arthur. Original intent. Original September 9th, 2023 notes. Thinking about it, conflict 2. Gnar would see a girl named Narissa and start catching feelings. They start hanging out, and when Gnar starts noticing how questionably moral his relationship with Arthur is, he starts making moves on her despite the fact that he's already going out with Arthur. Now he's gonna have to manage time with both of them until they start getting suspicious and both realize that Gnar has been cheating. Because of all this hanging out with both Arthur and Narissa, he kinda gets more and more distant from his good friends and colder, while also growing distant from his parents and his school. It's crazy how many things changed from what I was originally planning to what actually happened. Gnar, while dating Narissa, who's actually named Hailey, never questions the morals with Arthur and only does so in chapter 3. And I never write him becoming more and more distant with his friends or family, since he's close with his friends throughout the story and his family's barely even there in the first place. And Arthur never uses the isolationist manipulation tactic. Plus, Arthur ends up knowing that Gnar is dating Hailey and he just permits it. Chapter 2 was supposed to be different from Chapter 1 in focus. Instead of characterizing Arthur or focusing specifically and only on their relationship, he actually chills out and acts disturbingly in less obvious ways. I wanted to show that Gnar truly is a flawed kid by him cheating on his girlfriend with a guy and further showing his internal conflict with his sexuality, while also giving Hailey and other characters like Jace some spotlight to shine. Overall feelings. I actually think chapter 2 is good as opposed to flawed or alright like chapter 1. I do think that this right here is where the subtlety can either make or break your experience while reading. And by now, if you don't find the dynamic I've created interesting, then nothing else from here will work out in your eyes. Chapter 3 is where the story is at its greatest in every single aspect, and to this day, I still think that is some of my best writing due to its ending, even though I've got some more issues with it I can speak on. So here's what happens. Chapter 3, Part 0, Bonus. There was a small piece of dialogue in Chapter 2, Part 3 that talked about Arthur's sister visiting tomorrow. Chapter 3, Part 0 takes place then. It's really short and simple since we just get a little characterization for Ants, which is Arthur's sister, and we see that she dislikes Arthur a lot. Ants, you can go, Arthur. Arthur, can you not call me Arthur? Ants, can you not call me Antoine? Can you try and remember my age? I'm almost 19, not newly 15. Ants is the only member of Arthur's family that we see that isn't a major weirdo, and that she just has a playful crush on Radke, though it never goes anywhere. Part 1. Hailey confronts Gnar with what she finds on his phone, asking about who Arthur is. Gnar lies about him, but she calls him out and gets mad since he kept this hidden from her. And she tells him about how she felt ugly or like she was doing something wrong, and that she thought it was weird that he wouldn't reciprocate her feelings. Hailey, I've only ever seen you shirtless one time, but this random guy has probably sucked your dick? He did make you come, huh? Gnar, geez, stop. Hailey, no, all in his mouth, huh? Better than what your girlfriend could do, right? By the end, she's broken by the fact that she thinks that he just dated her so that he wouldn't look gay in front of his dad, and the realization that he's been dating Arthur since before they became a thing. And Gnar decides to be straightforwardly honest for once. Gnar, I'm basically just with him for sexual reasons now, but through dating you and because of how long we've known each other, I really do love you. If I can be honest, fully, you aren't ugly or anything, Hailey, but I'm not into women. That's the truth, completely. I've got no drive to be with a woman, and if we did anything, it'd feel forced. He apologizes, but Hailey doesn't forgive him, and when she asks if she was ever even a girlfriend to him, he just says kinda, and she tells him she never wants to see him again. This is his retelling of events to Jace, and though she tries to comfort him, he feels as if he doesn't deserve forgiveness. Gnar, I cheated on her for the entire time we were dating, with a guy. I mean, imagine liking a guy for months, you finally date, and then they cheat on you with another guy a month in. I did that to someone. Jace makes him promise to break it off with Arthur, and that's what he goes to do. When he gets to his house, Arthur's sister, Ant, who's actually 18 and not 14, opens the door and lets him in. Radke's there, so Gnar asks him about who they were, but Radke doesn't remember that. Ants thinks it might be the kid when they graduated, or maybe someone with they them pronouns, but Radke says it's unlikely since in 2016 when they graduated, that didn't catch on yet. We learn that Arthur never told Gnar anything about his past, and finally Arthur comes downstairs after a shower, which is when Gnar promptly breaks up with him. Gnar, no Arthur, it feels wrong because I destroyed her trust in me, for this. I don't like this, Arthur. It wasn't worth losing her even if it was my fault. Arthur, but after everything, Gnar, I need you. You're the only one I can really talk to. None of this works, and Gnar sticks with his decision, with Arthur believing that he'll come back to him. Part 1.5. 1.5 is a short, silly chapter with Ants and Radke talking. We'll let Radke basically raise Ants because Ants was kicked out of Arthur's house often since his mom hated her. Ants, I remember, yeah, she let me smoke when I was 16 though. Radke, oh my gosh, she looked exactly like Arthur too. I totally forgot. Ants, don't remind me. Part 2. By Thursday, Gnar is sitting in his room and thinking about calling Hailey, who didn't block him. And he goes to Arthur, who has a profile picture change, before Jace calls him and asks to hang out. After telling Arceus he broke it off with Arthur, they hang out at Flick-a-Lay. Raph asks about Hailey and Gnar says that they aren't together anymore, and that his birthday is in 3 days. They leave to go play video games, and Gnar thanks Jace for being a good friend. Magnum's confused and he tells him that he cheated on his girlfriend. Mag first thinks it must have been with Jace, but Gnar tells him that it was with Arthur, and Jace says that he was actually 25 and she admits that he threatened her. Cut to way later and Gnar's self-reflecting about how for some reason he still wants to talk to him. Out of a desire to make things right first, he decides to talk to Hailey, and tomorrow she comes over. Hailey, ever since like a day after you broke up, I know what I said, but I want to be friends, so it's like this constant feeling of go talk to him now, you know. I'm not too mad. Well, no, I mean, I'm mad and like I'd never date you again, but I was gonna ask to hang out to see if we could be cool eventually. They play video games and she asks about Arthur, but he says he was terrible. Hailey, if he was so bad, why didn't you just cut him off when we started dating? Gnar, cause I don't know. Hailey, no, you kept an entire relationship from me while we were dating. You owe me some kind of explanation. Gnar, okay. This will sound really bad, but I get it. I wanted the best of both worlds, like him for sex, you for actual dating. That's it. Things get really awkward and she can't believe that he was about to hide that too, so she decides that then and there she never wants to see him again. For real. And she leaves. That screws with Gnar's head a lot, and he spirals into thoughts of self-hatred because of him cheating, and he thinks about how Arthur and Hailey are both better than him. Gnar, Hailey and him are angels compared to me. I can only talk to him now though. Maybe I can say sorry to him like I was going to. He blames himself for not doing what Arthur wanted, and he decides that he needs to do what Arthur always wanted him to do. So he calls Arthur and they meet up where they first met. Gnar pushes himself to be really forward and he promises he won't flake out. Gnar, I know, but you know, I want to have Arthur. You want to fuck me? Gnar, yeah. Arthur, hard to say it? Gnar, I mean, I don't say stuff like that ever, so yeah. Arthur tells him he'll teach him how to please him, and after they hang out with some uncomfortable reminders of the past, they actually go to Arthur's house and he gets what he wanted. Gnar already has extreme regrets. Gnar, I'm just laying here like, was this even the right time and did I really want to do that? I can't answer either of those questions, so I don't know. Arthur doesn't get why he's thinking like this, so he says that what they did means a lot and that now they'll always be together, and that he clearly wanted this. He spirals a bit and says, was all of this just some kind of kink? Really? And please, for once, please be honest. What the fuck was any of this? This last 2-3 months, what was this? And in the most messed up line in the entire story, he says, what are you talking about? And the way Gnar looks at him impacts me still 3 years later. He then just lets out his feelings. I was thinking that if during some insane emotional moment that if we fucked like you wanted so badly, it'd fix everything and I'd be happy. But I don't feel that. He tells him he hates him and Arthur just can't believe it. And before Gnar leaves, he asks about what they meant. This makes Arthur more angry since it could have been a lot of things. My past relationships, 12th grade graduation, me and him. I don't know what he means. After this short and loud argument, Gnar sits outside and waits for Jace to pick him up. She's initially mad that he lied, but Gnar explains himself and she gets it. And Gnar awkwardly tells her that he loves her, but they decide not to mention this and pretend it didn't happen, which is where this part ends. Part 3. This part's just his 18th birthday, with Raph, Jace, and Ants there, though Magnum's late because he set his alarms and they all failed. Raph decides to tell Gnar something that he never ends up forgetting. Raph: I don't know why you broke up with her, and I'm not a player of any kind, but you'll be fine, man. I really mean it. And Gnar thinks, and I feel like those are words at a time where I needed them the most. And though they weren't from someone I always talk to, I don't think I'll forget them. Something about them was special, which is where the story ultimately ends. Original intent: September 9th, 2023. Part 3, Chapter 3, End. Gnar's girlfriend Narissa would find out that she was being cheated on by Gnar with a 25-year-old man named Arthur and promptly break up with him thereafter. And after some short self-reflection and a lot of thinking about Arthur, he decides to cut it off with him to improve himself by staying single. He'd make another voice recording about how his last 2 months felt horrible, but he'd conclude with himself that he doesn't exactly understand what he is, but he'll keep working on it and think about it in the future by himself while also trying to reconnect with his friends before he leaves high school for college. Similarly to part 2, it's insane how different this ended up being. The cheating thing being found out in part 1 was such a better choice, and it ending on his birthday with a little hopeful, optimistic message from Raph feels so much better than this, honestly really weird, vague timeskip ending. I wrote chapter 3 to be the explosion, and in fact I initially called the story Explosive Finale before I was inspired by Scott Pilgrim to simply name it the main character's name. To be transparent, I actually think that probably now 18-year-old me did very well for each of these parts. But by this point, I simply want to speak on the characters since they tie in massively to how I feel about part 3 and, well, the story as a whole. Arthur. Arthur is one of my favorite villains I've ever written, with him in second place behind my version of Rennie from Blood's Pretty. Even though he's technically a flat character that doesn't change throughout the story, the reasons for why he's one of my favorites are because of his utilization and the small amount of backstory we get as to why he's the way that he is. Environmental factors and partial unconscious manipulation. While he's a horrendous groomer, he isn't that way for no reason, as the few scenes of him interacting with his mom tells us a lot. She was also a manipulative predator who was obsessed with his dad and broke his boundaries constantly, while using fear tactics to keep him in check. Since Arthur emulates his mom a lot, it's clear that he would have most likely done the same to Gnar if he actually got him to move in with him. But how does Arthur emulate his mom exactly? He's irrationally obsessed with Gnar, like how his mom is with his dad, and this never changes. He just strips it back or controls himself a bit during chapter 2 and 3, but he still obsessively texts him. A lot of their manipulation tactics are the same. His mom in chapter 1 part 2.5 says, "But don't you love me?" Like how he says to Gnar many times, as if Gnar didn't do a specific thing he wanted, then it must signal that he doesn't love him, which unfairly gives power to Arthur. Or the constant boundary breaking and repetition of strange ideas to whittle down the victim's boundaries, which is something his mom does to him during his childhood, as we see in chapter 2 2.5. Her calling him cute over and over made him uncomfortable, but as we see in chapter 1 part 2.5, he's no longer bothered by it and feels as if this is just a regular thing. Plus, the casualness he had in chapter 1 part 3 with him saying that his mom taught him how to freaking kiss exemplifies this even more. Arthur does this exact thing to Gnar by trying to touch him a lot or explaining his weird knowledge, like in chapter 1 part 2. It's just, sometimes the law is nonsense, like with age of consent, until Gnar agrees with him and believes that this is a regular thing due to the repetition. And he even copies the words of his mother, like when he tells Jace to be more enthusiastic, which is something his mom clearly tells him, like in chapter 1 part 2.5 at the end. These environmental factors cause Arthur to partake in unconscious manipulation because these are simply things he picked up due to the house in which he was raised. He clearly never sat down or thought about speaking in this way to people, or if doing these things are wrong, because it's how he grew up, and it's how he thinks relationships should usually go. It's part of why he doesn't understand Gnar at the end when he says, "What are you talking about?" He's not actively manipulating Gnar a lot of the time, he's just being like who raised him. But even then, it's not as simple as him just emulating his mom and not realizing it, because he does also actively intentionally manipulate Gnar. I'll give 3 examples of this, even though there are a lot more. A moment that feels like an odd contradiction is when he told Gnar in chapter 1, "Just don't tell your parents about me, and if anyone asks about us, say I'm one of your friend's older brothers." And then in chapter 2 part 2, he goes out of his way to meet his friends. He does this because he wants to have the first impression on how he is to Gnar's friends and befriend them so that it'd feel more awkward for Gnar to try and distance himself from him, since he'd know people he already knew. And it's so that Gnar's possible description of Arthur can't contradict with how he portrays himself in front of those Gnar knows or what he says. He truly wants to embed himself into Gnar's social life with full control over how he's seen, and nobody in the story ever gets this because it's an oddly and extremely indirect form of manipulation. Not to mention that more usually manipulators will try to isolate their victims, with this being the opposite of that. Another is him making himself unreasonably reliable to Gnar. Arthur, you can be fully honest, Gnar, I understand. I won't be mad at you if you already did. I'll forgive you, in reference to when Gnar admitted that he led Hailey on, isn't simply obsessive. It's toxic for many reasons, the main two being that this sets a precedent that Gnar can basically do anything and Arthur will always be there through anything for him. And it allows Arthur to say that, as he says during their breakup, after everything, Gnar, I need you. You're the only one I can really talk to hit harder, because it's technically true. Arthur stuck it out with him and allowed him to date Hailey while dating him. No normal partner would do that, and it makes the other person, who would also be in the wrong in this instance, feel as if they owe the one that forgive them preemptively for basically anything. It's why in the end when Gnar breaks down, he thinks back to what Arthur wanted. He deserved better. He deserved what he wanted. Because it feels as if Arthur truly did let him do that out of genuine love for him, when it's truly a control tactic. Third is when Arthur attempts to make Gnar think that he wanted something due to his actions, when he didn't truly. Main example is a kissing scene, where Arthur tells Gnar that he obviously wanted the kiss because he didn't fight back, and the ending scene when they have sex and Gnar regrets it. All this adds more onto his question of what are you talking about at the end, where Gnar looks at him in this way. It hits so powerfully because half of Arthur actually doesn't know what he did wrong, and half of him intentionally use manipulation tactics. So even this question that sends Gnar over the edge is muddy and murky in terms of where it's coming from and his intent in asking the question. Unchanging plus no punishment. My favorite part of Arthur is that throughout every single thing that happens, he remains flat. He doesn't grow or ever realize how he hurt Gnar, and so he doesn't feel bad about it. But it feels as if he changed because he's way more lax in chapter 2 and 3 in comparison to how he was in chapter 1. This is because he changed up his strategy, and not because he actually changed, because he's still obsessed with Gnar and texting him constantly. It's more importantly notable because a big part of why Gnar stays or sticks it out with Arthur is because he believes relationships can change people, and it's not only because he finds him attractive. But this fact of why Gnar stays with him is undermined by his unchanging, consistent nature. Arthur changing wouldn't have made sense anyway because of how he grew up, with his mom being manipulative, abusive, and constantly boundary breaking with her own obsession with his father that she pushed onto him. That kind of baggage isn't something a 17-year-old who he's grooming can fix or help him with, since that requires years of therapy and self-reflection, both things that Arthur doesn't have. And so, since he's now 25, this way of thinking is truly and fully cemented into who he is, because he doesn't even understand that he needs change or redemption. And that leads into the most important part of why Arthur is the way he is. He receives no punishment for anything he does. Gnar loses Hailey, damages the trust of his best friend, and even loses his innocence to the hand of Arthur, who mostly gained in this situation and lost practically nothing except Gnar and Radke. His mom's still paying for where he lives, so he never needs to get a job. Law enforcement never enters the mind of Arthur, since what he's doing is technically illegal, and he practically gets to roam free and do this again to another person, which will be even easier with Radke gone by the end. Arthur, you can't pull us apart, Jace, you just can't. It's 100% completely and literally true. Gnar's the only one who has to do it because the law won't help in this situation. The biggest loss he faced was the loneliness he has to go through, because Arthur in reality is a bum who knows nobody that likes him aside from his abusive mother. With deep baggage, trauma, and a belief that he's not really doing anything wrong and no consequences for anything he's done, why would he change? I find this to be one of the strongest aspects of his character because it makes sense and it's realistic. Not every bad person in the real world is going to get the justice they deserve, and sometimes they get their way and are allowed to walk scot-free, and that's what Arthur represents. Transactional love plus mysteriousness. Arthur genuinely believes he loves Gnar, but what love means to him is totally warped in comparison to Gnar or anyone else. When Radke said love means nothing to you in part 1.5 of chapter 1, he wasn't being snarky, because he sees it as almost like a currency. He pledges allegiance to Gnar, tells him he'd never leave and always forgives him, that he'd buy him things or provide him housing for free, and because of that he expects Gnar to act in a way that he wants due to him feeling like he's owed something because of his feelings and obsessive, unreasonable, and quickly formed devotion. If you loved me, you'd do what I wanted for me. Arthur buying him jackets, driving him places, or all of this isn't a manipulation tactic in itself, unlike a lot of other things he does. He genuinely thinks that this is how it should work. It's toxic, and even if Gnar was also an adult, or if Arthur was also a teen, it couldn't have worked because this isn't how love should be like. Gnar shouldn't owe Arthur anything for loving him. They should simply want what's best for each other, and yet Arthur's idea of what it means to love was put into Gnar's head due to what happened to him. And it ties into his mysteriousness because he uses love as a shield to not talk about anything difficult or about his past. The story's a lot more uncomfortable when you realize that we really know nothing about this guy, and neither does Gnar. All we're given is what his mom did to him, and otherwise his past is foggy, and we'd have to piece together what everything could mean or represent with the unanswered clues we're given. We never learn who they are, or about 12th year graduation, or anything more from his childhood outside of the chapter 2.5. And even the clues or pieces we're given are small. Ant and Radke know about it since they grew up with Arthur, but we never learn anything about Arthur, and neither does Gnar, because he never gets close to Ant or Radke within the story. All he knows is that he's just a hot 25-year-old guy, and all we know for sure is that he's a 25-year-old groomer who was hurt by his mom. Even in a conversation we see this sort of thing, with Gnar asking about what kid, and Ant and Radke were talking about Arthur's 12th grade graduation as if they all mutually knew about it. Ant, did he never talk about his past or something? Gnar, not really. It's why Gnar feels like Arthur's lying or hiding something, because we know he for sure lied once, but we don't know what he's hiding or if he lied again at some point in an attempt to hide something like he did with Jace. It's creepy, and it's why Arthur feels like he's always lying or thinking way too deeply about what he's going to say, which is part of what makes him uncomfortable to watch on top of the more obviously perverted stuff that he does. Arthur Overview. Arthur's a victim of circumstance, but it's impossible to feel sympathy for him because of how he is. He's smart, secretive, and clearly calculating, but also overly emotional and lets his desires control him without fully knowing about or acknowledging the damage that he causes to those around him. This doesn't make him stupid, however, but instead undisciplined and controlled by what he wants instead of what he should do. It's why he's not sympathetic but understandable, and it's what makes him work in my eyes after this analysis of my old first real villain character. Gnar. While Gnar's certainly a victim, I wanted to make him extremely flawed so that wouldn't be all that he is. But because of his insensitivity, desire to stay comfortable, keep what he personally wants, and his consistent aversion to anything difficult, he ends up destroying what he had with Hailey. Through all of this though, there's a strange sense of optimism and a weird sense that everything will be alright. First, I want to speak on how exactly Gnar is a victim, how he sees Arthur throughout the story, and how that develops, and how him being a victim of this horrible treatment from Arthur doesn't excuse any of his bad actions throughout the story. Partial fault and comfortability. The thing about Gnar is that he isn't just groomed, but instead he's clearly still a flawed teenager that accidentally hurts others both because of that grooming and because of his flaws as a teenager. And everything Arthur did to him was completely messed up and wrong, but partial fault comes in with Hailey because of everything that Arthur told Gnar and got him to believe. Arthur made himself out to Gnar as someone who was ultimately trustworthy, a person that he could always depend on, and someone who, no matter what, would always be there for him. If Arthur hadn't put that idea firmly into his head to the point that it was practically normal to him, as we see in chapter 2, part 3's time skip, then it's way more likely that he would have just left Arthur because of his growing disdain for him and his disgusting antics. And there's also the fact that Gnar fully believed that Arthur relied on him to keep going, as he says, but I think I couldn't leave him. He kind of depends on me. There were some serious mind games Arthur was playing when it came to what he told Gnar and how he internalized it, but I only say that this is partial fault because Gnar's still somewhat in the wrong. The selfishness on display throughout the story with how he speaks about both Arthur and Hailey is just insane, because he's trying to see something that's unnatural, dishonest, and bad as a logical thing to break down and make good, even though he knows it's wrong. I know that'd be horrible on all levels, and eventually I'd be caught, but breaking it off is too hard, so in chapter 2, part 2, or one hot guy and one romantically interesting person wants me, but no, it's wrong. In chapter 2, part 3 summarizes his feelings perfectly. He's not fully respecting either Arthur or Hailey, and instead he sees the two more as beings to satisfy specific desires he has at the fault of one of their trust, that being Hailey. This selfishness and willingness to lie when you know you're doing something wrong has nothing at all to do with the grooming Arthur imposed upon him, because it's just a genuine flaw in how Gnar is. I think his general coldness towards Hailey when she's speaking on her wanting more affection from him sums this up well too. He just says okay, looks neutrally at her, and tries to make up reasons as to why he's not acting like an actual boyfriend, because he doesn't want to have a hard conversation with her and tell her that he's not sexually attracted to women, break it off with her, or Arthur, or even tell her the truth of the situation. He'd much rather try and keep up this garbage of being her boyfriend when he doesn't want to do everything that role informally entails. It's clear that even though his mind certainly was altered by what Arthur said, with him logically arguing for their relationship or excusing any weird aspects not being something he would have done under normal circumstances without Arthur's influence, Gnar's still just a teenager. I think that him doing all of this doesn't make him hateable or super dislikable, but instead it gives you all the feeling of, holy crap, that was stupid, because he's a teen and he himself makes stupid choices since he's not mentally as developed as someone like Arthur. The only way he would have crossed into hateable territory like Arthur would be if he began being genuinely toxic to Hailey and Arthur, if he had no remorse for everything he did, or if he was like Arthur and had no idea that anything he did in the first place was harmful. But remorse is what pushed him to try and make things right by having sex with Arthur in the end. It wasn't really the right choice, but it and the conversation he had at the end with Jace showed that even though Gnar's insensitive and cold, he genuinely wishes he could say sorry. Immaturity and impulsiveness. One of the most notable aspects of Gnar is his general immaturity. It's very difficult to notice and must be pointed out that he and his friends usually speak in longer sentences or use words like or very often, or that they're bad at explaining their feelings because they're all teenagers. Moments like Hailey saying she's not mad at Gnar after she meets him after he cheated, to then saying that she actually is mad, or Gnar's long-winded explanation of why he didn't want to have relations with Arthur in Chapter 2 Part 1, and moments like Chapter 1 Part 1 where Arceus demands for Gnar to block the mystery girl feel like bloating, but it's intentionally there to contrast with specifically Arthur and how he speaks. Arthur's speech, and for that measure, every adult speech, is far shorter and more measured than the younger characters because they're more developed, and it's why Arthur's able to give what feels like confident advice, a normal and good apology, or intentionally manipulate Gnar as if it's completely natural. Arthur isn't necessarily smarter than Gnar, it's just that he's mentally more developed than him, and so in this way, that's how it manifests. Gnar, though, isn't stupid. He overthinks a lot, he's very logical a lot of the time, and he's quick to understand, but he's still naive and, like a child, is scared to lose a comfort he's used to, or take risks despite being impulsive. He genuinely believes that he can somehow change or fix Arthur, and that he seriously loves him, and that things will go well, when for us, we can practically foresee that this will be horrible from the start. And it's his impulsiveness, which is part of his immaturity, that pushes him to get into a relationship with Hailey, something that he fully chose to do on his own volition. He finds her cute without actually being attracted to her, and she's making moves on him. Well, he sees this as time to kiss. Even though Gnar thinks a lot, he doesn't think often before a lot of his actions, and this massively bad thing he does in this story could have been sidestepped if he simply rejected Hailey's advances. The same is true for Arthur. If he just didn't say in Chapter 1 Part 1, so this means we're like boyfriends now, right? Then the entire story wouldn't have happened. All it took to see Arthur's red flags on their first date was a tiny bit of reflection on what he was doing, and bam, Gnar would have most likely deleted the app and moved on instead of attempting to fix him. Gnar Overview. While Gnar was a self-insert that was based off of me, he's still extremely different from me, to the point that rereading this made me realize that he barely even feels like a stand-in for how I was at the time. I still think he's a great protagonist for the story, and I honestly can't see it working in a similar way or being as good if he was just even slightly different. And through all of this, he's never hateable as he's just a teenager. Hailey. I wanted a foil for Arthur with her, and while I think I did alright, I also dragged a bit with her characterization and overall utilization within the comic. Do-gooder. Hailey always tries her best. Boundaries? She aggressively respects them. Honesty? We should be 100% with each other, you know? Or even clarity in her actions, with her obviously making moves on Gnar or making it clear that she feels other kinds of ways. It's as if she just acts fully depending on how she feels in the moment and says what she wants to without a filter or restraint. She goes in 100%, risking everything emotionally. It's why she's so harsh when she jokes, or why she's so blunt even when she is with Gnar. And it's completely against how Arthur acts. Arthur feels calculating, dishonest in a way that's impossible to describe with each word, and like he's only worried about what he wanted himself. He's a creep who's 8 years older than Gnar and speaks about how the age of consent should be lower, while Hailey's just a girl that likes him from high school that's 2 years older than him. There's nothing bad about Hailey. Gnar's comfortable around her, they find each other funny, and the chemistry between these two is incredible, and yet Gnar still chooses Arthur, a loser who relies on his mom for everything, who's notably older than him, who he has way less chemistry with, all for sexual reasons. The thing is, Gnar clearly likes Hailey as a friend and he finds her cute. He conflated feelings of finding a friend or acquaintance enjoyable to talk to, or the feeling of I want to hang out with them as I want to date them. So he entertained the idea without actually wanting to date them due to a misunderstanding what the feeling actually was. It was a girl he liked talking to and a girl who was interested in him. Maybe dating her so that he could keep talking to her wouldn't be that bad, but Hailey wanted Gnar as more than a friend in a regular, natural, and completely alright way. It's this massive disconnect in how each other truly see one another that destroys everything. Gnar just wanted a friend and Hailey wanted a boyfriend. He agreed to be her boyfriend, so she tries her absolute best for him, but he just sees her as a friend. That's why when they speak for the second and last time, when Hailey asks if he ever saw her as a girlfriend, he just says kinda because he didn't want to lie. Bluntness plus low screen time. This is the only main character I actually have a notable issue with. I didn't practice this side of Hailey at all before I ended up writing her in the story, as I instead emulated her off of an awkward girl I actually knew in real life, since everyone in this story is based off of people I knew in high school from real life at the time, except for Arthur, who's a unique character I made up. But I realized she had no flaws, so I gave her the flaw of being too blunt or mean. This isn't only a bit inconsistent throughout the story, and also poorly referred to in chapter 2 part 3 when she says, "I was so weird when we started dating," but it also weakens her likability. Her entire character hinges off of if you like her or not, so making her a jerk to people like Raph or Arceus for no reason, and then changing her a bit in chapter 2 part 3 post 2-week time skip was just a weak move. The amount of screen time she gets is just criminal. It's less than Jason, probably a little less than Radke if I'm being honest. She deserved to have more time so that we could get used to who she is, and so that she could be more than Gnar's girlfriend he ignores the advances of. Even if her really good moments are really good. I think her chapter 2 moments where her and Gnar are hanging out are great. I just think she should have went with Magnum, Jace, and Gnar and Arthur to Quicks instead of not coming. Now, off script a little bit, but I realize that Gnar didn't reject her from going to Quicks with them because specifically for the reason that he actually stated, which was because of how she was, because she's mean whenever she jokes with people, as she did with his sister. But it's because Jace knew that Gnar was dating Arthur, and Hailey would have obviously introduced herself as Gnar's girlfriend, and Gnar was trying to keep it secret that he was dating Hailey. So I actually don't agree with that. I think it makes a lot more sense for Gnar to just be like, "Oh no, you can't go. I don't want you to see Arthur," or because Jace is gonna be there. I think that makes a lot more sense actually. So, because the only way that would have made sense would be like if Gnar was stupid and just didn't think about that, which he's not stupid. He did think about that, which is why I didn't invite Hailey. But I disagree with that now. I think that could have been an interesting interaction between Hailey and Arthur. It would have been unique. And I said a few times that would have been a cool moment. But thinking about it while writing the script and what actually happened, it actually makes sense. It's really funny that I'm coming to new realizations while I'm reading the script. But anyway, on to the actual scripted part of the video. Here we are. Ant and Radke. I totally hoed these two characters completely. Jace and Magnum got a solid amount of page time and served their purposes well. And even Arceus got enough as another supporting figure to help ground Gnar. But Ant and Radke didn't get much. Starting with Ant, her purpose was twofold. I wanted to show that members of Arthur's family aren't doomed to being horrible for any kind of genetic reason. It was purely Arthur's environment that made him the way he was, and it was Ant's environment that made her the way that she ended up being, which is a lot like Radke. Since for the second reason, I wanted to show that Arthur's mom was totally obsessed with Arthur to the point that she didn't care at all for her daughter and frequently kicked her out. But I think I screwed this up because she technically wasn't all that necessary, and she came on a win since while I was making the story, I reread the part where Arthur said that he had a sister and decided to introduce her late into the story. I had that mindset of everything must be useful, which is why I made that decision. And while that's a good way of writing, planning helps majorly with it. That's why Ant has basically no screen time, even though I try to make her feel important. Really, she only exists in bonus chapters similarly to Radke, and while chapter 3 part 0 was really fun, she feels crammed in and unnecessary due to me adding her because of a single joke piece of dialogue that I didn't want to go to waste. Radke though is my biggest blunder in the story. I wanted him to do a lot, but because the story is so Gnar focused, he only really exists in bonus chapters. His purpose was to make it clear that Arthur's truly a loser and that nobody likes him since Arthur's never shown to have any friends, and even the person he lives with and knew since childhood doesn't like him. I think that idea is solid for indirectly showcasing that fact, and I think the whole they mystery, which really is unanswered and only alluded to in some parts as to what it could mean, is actually very powerful and interesting. But overall, he feels more like he'd be some kind of spin-off or goofy character as opposed to a character that's actually from the story because of how he is. Radke's issue is that most of what he does is too blunt, clear, or just weird. The implications that Radke and Arthur dated at some point in high school was flat out too obvious, and while I best implied this in chapter 2 part 2.5, I made it too obvious at the start. He hugs Arthur like how he used to. In part 3.5 of chapter 1, Arthur calls him Ronnie, and it's just a mystery that fails at being subtle, and it's so easy to find out in comparison to every single other subtle thing I chose to point out throughout the story. The most interesting thing I did was imply that Arthur cheated on Radke during chapter 2 part 2, when Arthur says, "I cheated a bit too," in reference to when he was Gnar's age. Since this is very indirect and never comes up again, you get a clue as to what the 12th grade graduation could have meant more deeply, but I don't think any of this makes sense from the ground up. Radke's not gay, and he never does anything gay, so he should have just been Arthur's previous best friend that now reluctantly lives with him because he hates him. And the whole thing where Radke's banging Arthur's mom is immature, unfitting of the story, and flat out stupid because of how absurd it is. Plus, it's weird because Radke hates predators and he totally knows that Arthur's mom abused Arthur. Why would he do that? Overall, I believe Radke as a side character is alright, and while I like ants and their extremely limited appearances, they feel more like they'd be main characters in their own side story as opposed to important characters for this story because of how they are. They require a lot more of their own focus to work, but the story never does that for them. Jace and Magnum. I actually think I used Jace and Magnum very well throughout the story. While their uses are quite minimal as they only majorly appear in 2 parts, it's enough to get down the most important fact that Gnar and his friends are all just regular teenagers. Jace importantly grounds Gnar and stops him from going all in with Arthur in a way that isn't romantic, like Hailey by questioning him and Arthur. She cares a ton about him and wishes for the best, so as a friend she genuinely tries her absolute best even if she's rather raunchy and vulgar in the way she jokes. If this were some kind of comedy, she'd be the straight man grounding each and every wild element, and Magnum's totally oblivious to everything. He thinks Arthur's cool, and because of that, we see that if Jace never found out about Arthur earlier, then Arthur's plan of trying to get into Gnar's social circles could have actually worked, and Gnar would have been in a really bad spot then. I can already imagine Gnar wanting to leave and Arthur using the fact that he knows his best friend against him as an additive in order to keep him contained within their relationship. Jace also important too, as she, like Hailey and Arthur, fight in terms of how Gnar sees love. He says "I love you" to Jace at the end, genuinely as a friend, because compared to Hailey where he was practically lying since he just wanted to keep the friendship intact, and Arthur where he was coerced into saying it, he actually deeply cares for Jace. This time though, not in a romantic way, because they're close friendship wise. Jace always sits by Gnar, always has his back, and no matter what, is always trying to make sure he's okay, even when he goes behind her back like he did at the end. And even when her boyfriend Magnum is right there. It's why Mag said, "What the fuck, Jace?" when Gnar admitted to cheating on his girlfriend in front of him. Or why when Gnar said he asked a girl out, Arceus assumed it was Jace in chapter 1, despite their relationship being purely platonic, albeit strong. On another level, it enforces the final message Raph gives to Gnar about how he'll be okay. He already has a friend he loves and doesn't necessarily need to be with someone to feel fulfilled. And without these two, the story would simply be too dark. Mechanically, they offer fun and levity at times when we need it, and they allow for Gnar to escape a little bit from either the bad he's going through or the bad that he caused to others. Constant darkness without stopping is emotionally draining and eventually gets dull. It's part of why I added the bonus chapters, and in the main story, these two help a lot with it. Now yes, the story does get a lot darker by chapter 2 and 3, but thanks to them, they still help it majorly. And my tonal control improving throughout makes the amount of darkness enough to not be tiring. Final words and conclusion. January 13th, 2024. That's where this comes from. I intend for this story to be a tragedy, as pretty much nothing ever goes right, and everything just seems to get worse endlessly due to Gnar's age and impulsiveness. It's undeniably intended to be a sad story with some humorous parts due to absurdity or awkward dialogue, but I do have a reason for this. What I want people to take away from this comic is mostly 2 things. Sexuality is confusing and inconsistent, especially when you're a teenager, and 2, a better understanding on the impact of grooming and verbal abuse. Realistically, as a sexually confused 18-year-old myself who hasn't been groomed or verbally abused in the way Arthur abuses Gnar before, these are pretty difficult writing goals to achieve, but I think I can do it. I could say a lot more about how I feel on this comic, but I think this is enough. It feels weird to come back to this old comic and have mostly positive things to say about it. I expected to hate this work or to rip it to shreds, like how I would with some of my other past works that suck. But what I found is an actually pretty deep, albeit niche, complex character-focused comic that requires multiple rereads and a lot of examination to fully understand. It's definitely not for everyone because of the subject matter. The art isn't that good, my handwriting is bad, but it is special, and if you want to check it out yourself, then, again, join the first Discord link in the description. And hey, if the video is successful and y'all want more from this comic, then too bad. But I can make a short, silly little spin-off comic for Ant and Radke. I've actually been thinking about that for years, surprisingly. Next video is going to be the third part to Blood's Pretty. Hope you enjoyed this one and subscribe, because holy crap, I put a lot of work into this. I think this will be my longest video. Let's see.